Here we have crusades, plagues, and the ultimate collapse of the Byzantine Empire. Another threat faced the Byzantine Empire was the plague of Justinian, which decimated the population of the empire between 541 current era and 552. During its peak, the plague led to the death of 5,000 people each day in Constantinople. The Crusades, which were initially meant to assist the Constantinople-based empire to reclaim its lost territories, ultimately became a threat to the Byzantine Empire. The Fourth Crusade of 1204, in particular, was incredibly devastating to the Byzantine Empire. Their soldiers in the crusade mutinied and invaded Constantinople, where they engaged in widespread looting, vandalism, and destruction. The event, which came to be known as the Sack of Constantinople, weakened the Byzantine Empire's military and economic influence, which led to the invasion of the Ottoman Turks in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Ottoman Empire was ultimately victorious in the Byzantine-Ottoman Wars, which culminated in the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Now, I was thinking about the plague also, and it's funny they say this because we have this inconsistency with plague timelines as well. So if we look at this, we have the plague of Constantinople, 541 to 542. And then we have the Black Plague, which is said to have come from the Crusades and from the Silk Road. So the Black Death, also known as the pestilence, the Great Mortality, was a bubonic plague pandemic occurring in Afro-Asia from 1346 to 1353. It is the most fatal pandemic recorded in human history, causing the death of 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351. It says the Black Death was the beginning of the second plague pandemic. The plague created religious, social, and economic upheaval with profound effects on the course of European history. So the origin of the Black Death is disputed. The pandemic originated either in Central Asia or East Asia, but its first definitive appearance was in Crimea in 1347. From Crimea, it was most likely carried by fleas living on the black rats that travelled on Genesee ships spreading through the Mediterranean basin, maybe deliberately travelling on Genesee ships, and reaching North Africa, Western Asia, and the rest of Europe via Constantinople. So here we have the Black Death in 1347 in Constantinople, Byzantine Empire. It's the second plague pandemic. What does that mean? What was the first plague pandemic? Overview. There have been 3 major outbreaks of plague. The plague of Justinian in the 6th and 7th century is the first known attack on record and marks the first firmly recorded pattern of plague. From historical descriptions, as much as 40% of the population of Constantinople died from the plague. Modern estimates suggest that half of Europe's population died as a result of the first plague pandemic before it disappeared in the 700s. So that's almost half of the population of Constantinople. And it just makes me wonder that around this time we have the Islamic forces attacking Constantinople, and yet they were still able to recover, having lost around half their population. After 750, plague did not appear again in Europe until the Black Death of the 14th century. Okay, so 14th century, we've got the plague in Constantinople between 541 and 542, and we have the plague back again in 1347 or in the 1300s. So 800 years later, 800 years, and this plague rears its head again. The same thing. This makes no sense at all. And I'm thinking that potentially this was the same plague that was recorded, and they've just re-recorded it. They've doubled up on this information, changing the date from 540 to 1340. Now, what was the third plague? The third plague pandemic was the major bubonic plague pandemic that began in Yunnan, China in 1855. This episode of bubonic plague spread to all inhabited continents and ultimately led to more than 12 million deaths in India and China, and perhaps over 15 million worldwide. The name refers to this pandemic being the third major bubonic plague outbreak to affect European society. The first began with the plague of Justinian, which ravaged the Byzantine Empire and surrounding areas in 541 to 542. The pandemic persisted in successive waves until the middle of the 8th century. The second began with the Black Death, which killed at least 1/3 of Europe's population in a series of expanding waves of infections from 1346 to 1353. This pandemic reoccurred regularly until the 19th century. Casualty patterns indicate that waves of this late 19th century, 20th century pandemic may have come from two different sources. The first was primarily bubonic and was carried around the world through ocean-going trade, through transporting infected persons, rats, cargoes harboring fleas. The second, more virulent strain was primarily pneumonic in character with a strong person-to-person contagion. The strain was largely confined to Asia. What does this plague have in common? Is the Silk Road and ocean-going trade. Now, if we want to look at plague in the Bible, there's only one instant in Revelation where God sends plague on people. So if you want to believe that plagues come from God or a judgment on people, the plague that comes in the Bible, we have first off the seal judgments, we have the trumpet judgments, then we have the bowl judgments, and this is what I believe is in the second tribulation period of Revelation. The first being, as I said, against Jerusalem of 70 AD. So it's the first bowl judgment, and it says, "So the first went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came upon the men who had the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image." Now, if you go back and watch my Crusade, Are We in the Little Season of Satan videos, I believe that this was the bubonic plague. They have a foul sore that comes up on their body where the blood coagulates under the skin and in the lymph. The following bowl judgments, the sea became blood. The third, the springs of water became blood. The fourth bowl judgment, men are scorched with fire. The fifth, darkness and pain. And the sixth bowl, the Euphrates, dries up. The seventh bowl is the earthquake judgment, and a great earthquake as had not occurred since men were on earth. And I think this is what caused the mud flood. So have they combined these plagues of Constantinople? Have they combined the Crusades, the time, and expanded it, added more time in this period? I'm going to, for my own enjoyment, go and study this, but this video is getting pretty long now, and I think I'll leave it to another time if I do any more investigating into this. But I think there's something here as to hidden history, hidden time, and the 1,000-year period that has been messed with or fudged in the ancient history books. If we look at coins, it says that, I'm just going to Quora here. The question is, what is the oldest coin with a date? It says here, Roman coins can be dated as they show the emperor's number of years as a consul, so he can be accurately dated that way. First English coin using the current Christian era, written with modern Arabic numerals, is opposed to Latin, was the Edward VI crown in 1551. So here we have this time period again, around 1600, 1551, that is showing up again as the first time we start using dates. Someone's put an answer. What is the oldest coin with a date? Answer, we think the oldest American coin with a date might be this 12 shillings from Boston, Massachusetts in 1652. And again, is that an I? Is that a 1? Possibly they're using Roman numerals rather than ones, because we have the Roman numerals here, the 1 and the Roman 1 is exactly the same. The first coin dated Guinness World Records, they're saying that the earliest dated coin in the Christian era is Bishop of Roskilde coins, and it's in a Roman numerals. It's said to be 1234. So the fact that it's dated with Roman numerals shows that it's Old World and not New World, which would have the English numbers. Justinianic plague is the popular name for a pandemic of bubonic plague in the late Roman or Byzantine Empire, which first appears in our source in 541 current era. The pandemic reappeared in waves in different regions over the next 200 years, ending in 750. We call it the Justinianic plague because the first outbreak corresponds with the reign of Emperor Justinian. Justinian, who resided in the imperial capital of Constantinople, was himself reportedly a casualty of the disease, although he did not die from it. Because there have been multiple pandemics of bubonic plague in history, scholars sometimes refer to the Justinianic plague as the first plague pandemic, so as to distinguish it from the second plague pandemic in the 14th century, also known as the Black Death, and the third plague pandemic in the 19th century. Scholars still debate precisely where the Justinianic plague originated. Our literary sources place its origins in Africa, but other evidence suggests that it likely came from Central Asia. In fact, bubonic plague is an extremely old disease, and scientists have detected the DNA of the pathogen that causes it in Bacterium Yersinia pestis in the remains of late Neolithic era humans. We know that plague first hit cities in the southeastern Mediterranean and moved swiftly through the Levant to the imperial capital of Constantinople, where it was first reported in 541 current era. From there, it spread westward through regions of the former Roman Empire, reaching as far north as Germany and Britain. In the past, scholars thought that rats were the primary vectors of the disease, meaning that they were the animals that carried fleas, which act as hosts to the bacteria, which in turn infected humans. However, we now think that humans, who can also carry fleas and lice, spread the disease to each other directly rather than rats. We are fortunate to have several eyewitness accounts of the Justinianic plague, including 2 highly detailed descriptions of the disease, which also depicts the plague's social and economic impact on the infected community. Our best historical source is Procopius of Caesarea in modern Israel, a high official in the Roman government who lived in Constantinople during the first wave of plague from 542 to 543. Procopius offered many insights into the plague causes and symptoms, describing the telltale buboes or swollen lymph nodes, as well as the extensive death toll and its social and psychological impact. Another great plague source is John of Ephesus in modern Turkey, a Christian bishop living in Syria who lived in the same time as Procopius. He wrote about the plague in Palestine and Syria, and his narrative aligns with Procopius' account in the interesting ways. It's clear that they are both discussing the same disease. So their writings, Procopius and John of Ephesus, describe the plague in lurid details, from the disease's physical symptoms, fever, chills, disorientation, swollen and in some cases oozing buboes, to the disruptive impact on the rhythms of daily life. We learn, for instance, that the number of dead from the disease quickly outpaced families' capacity to bury their loved ones properly. Strikingly, both witnesses report that the situation became so dire in Constantinople that Justinian's government had to direct the removal of bodies from the city and their mass burial outside the walls. Well, today we are accustomed to the state assisting the public during emergencies, especially with the handling of bodies and burials. Justinian's intervention in the care of the dead was unprecedented. Thanks to recent works of paleogeneticists who were able to isolate and identify the A DNA of Y. pestis from the dental pulp of 6th and 7th and 8th century human teeth, we now know definitely that bubonic plague circulated around the Byzantine and former Western Roman Empire at this time. Bubonic plague is a bacterial infection, so it's not viral. If it's bacterial, it can be cultured and spread. In theory, it can be used deliberately, I guess. With today's doctors, cure relatively easily with antibiotics. However, without such modern treatments, the Justinianic plague sickened and killed large numbers of people, with somewhere between 60 and 80% mortality rate for infected individuals. Now, if there's any ancient knowledge on bacteria and how to cultivate bacteria, how to spread bacteria, then this plague could have potentially been deliberate. So how did the plague go away for 700 years and then resurface? How is this plague, and why is this plague of this bacterial Y. pestis? If it was always there, it would always be life-threatening. So why in a period of around 700 years has it spiked and then come back again? And is the history that is referring to the first and the second plague the same history that's been rehashed? So volcanism and the Justinian plague between 541 and 543 CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Justinian, bubonic plague spread through countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea. This was a decade after Justinian forces had begun to restore the Roman Empire's lost territory in North Africa, Spain, Italy, and present-day Balkans by expeditions out of Byzantium, the Eastern Empire. At its height, the plague of Justinian was killing 5,000 people each day in Constantinople, eventually to consume 20 to 40% of its population, and between 25 to 50 million people across the empire. Like the European Black Death of the middle 14th century, the bacterium Yersinia pestis originated in Central Asia, and it carried in the gut of fleas that live on rats. The traditional explanation of both plagues was that plague spread westward along the Silk Road, and then with black rats that infested shipborne grain cargoes. Plausible as that might seem, Yersinia pestis fleas and rats have always existed and remain present to this day. Trade along the same route continued unbroken for more than 2 millennia. Although plagues with the same agents reoccurred regularly, only the plague of Justinian and the Black Death resulted in tens of millions of deaths over short periods. Some other factors seem likely to have boosted fatalities to such levels. 5 years before the plague struck, the Byzantine historian Procopius recorded a long period of fog and haze that continually reduced sunlight, typical features of volcanic aerosol veils. Following this was the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years, as recorded by tree ring studies. It coincides with documentary evidence of famine in China, Ireland, and the Middle East and Scandinavia. A 72-meter-long ice core extracted from the Colnifeti Glacier in the Swiss Alps in 2013 records the last 2 millennia of local climate change and global atmospheric dust levels. Sampled by laser slicing, the core has yielded a time series of data at a resolution of months or better. In 536 in Iceland, an Icelandic volcano emitted ash and probably sulfur dioxide over 18 months, during which summer temperature fell by about 2 degrees Celsius. A second eruption followed in 540 and 541. Volcanic winter conditions lasted from 536 to 545. amplifying the evidence from tree ring data from the 1900s. In Revelation 16, we have verse 10, "And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds." So, men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. In verse 8, "And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire." Now we know when there's solar activity, it also makes the volcanic activity act up on earth. Revelation 6:12 also talks about, "And behold, when he opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood." I think this was at an earlier timeline. There's no talk about plague in these seal judgments. When we have the seal judgments, we have the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but none of them speak of plague. Only the pale horse, it says, "Behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him, and power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with beasts of the earth." It doesn't say anything about plague. And I think if we're looking for a potential natural reason for the sun and the sun to be darkened and the moon to be made blood around the time of 70 AD, we have Mount Vesuvius erupting with Pompeii. They say 79 AD. It's around that region. I mean, they can never be 100% accurate with these times. When we start looking into the historical records of where they get this information, it's sketchy. The plague of Justinian coincided with the second volcanic winter after several years of regional famine. This scenario is paralleled by the better documented Great Famine of 1315 to 17 that ended the 2 centuries of economic prosperity during the 11th and 13th centuries. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide in a population weakened through malnutrition to an extent that we can barely imagine a modern Europe. Any pandemic disease would have resulted in the most affected dying in millions. Another parallel with the plague of Justinian is that it follows the ending of 4 centuries of medieval warm period, during which vast quantities of land were successfully brought under the plough and the European population had tripled. That ended with a succession of major sulfur-rich volcanic eruptions in Indonesia at the end of the 13th century that heralded the Little Ice Age. I just want to know where they're talking about the Justinian plague, which was in the 500s, and comparing it with the 13th century. And why do we have this repeat in the cycle of time in the historical records? And is it really a repeat? Although geologists generally concern themselves with the social and economic consequences of volcanoes, lava and ash in its immediate vicinity, the Pompeii view, its potential for global catastrophe is far greater in the case of really large and often remote events. And we're seeing this with the Tongan eruption, which is now cooling the earth down in the southern hemisphere and starting to reach the northern hemisphere. Chemical data from the same ice core reveals the broad economic consequences of the mid-6th century plague. Lead concentrations in the ice deposited as airborne pollution from smelting of lead sulfur ore to obtain silver bullion fell and remained at low levels for a century. The recovery of silver production for coinage is marked by a spike in glacial lead concentrations in 640. Another parallel with the Black Death, which was followed by a collapse in silver production, albeit only for 400 to 500 years. So if we look at the CDC website and we look at what is anthrax, and it says anthrax is a serious infectious disease caused by gram-positive rod-shaped bacteria known as Bacillus anthracis. It occurs naturally in soil and commonly affects domestic and wild animals around the world. People can get sick with anthrax if they come in contact with infected animals or contaminated animal products. Anthrax can cause severe illness in both humans and animals. I just want to know what turns anthrax from something that's kind of benign in the soil, obviously it's there all the time, to something that is severely contagious and lethal to human beings. During 2001, the 9/11 attacks, there was also a known anthrax attack. It occurred in the US over the course of several weeks beginning on September 18th of 2001. And letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to several news media offices and to Democratic senators. Now, I don't know of any conspiracies regarding this or related to 9/11, but it just goes to show that this contagious bacteria has been weaponized and potentially used to contaminate societies. So in this Business Insider article, it's discussing the topic of the deadly plague could potentially be released as a cloud above a city, killing thousands, according to a bioterrorism expert. When 2 cases of plague popped up in New Mexico in June, they served as a reminder that the Black Death, yes, the plague, is still around. The infection affects a handful of people in the US every year and between a few hundred and a few thousand annually around the world. Most people survive a plague infection these days since it can almost always be treated with antibiotics. But researchers, bioweapons experts and governments still worry that the plague could be turned into a deadly bioweapon, especially if someone with a terroristic intent were to find or engineer a strain that couldn't be treated with common drugs. The plague bacteria Yersinia pestis mutates regularly like any other organism. Drug-resistant strains have emerged several times in the wild. For that reason, as Stat News' Eric Budman explained in a profile of wildlife biologist and plague detective Dr. Wagner, there's always a scramble to identify plague strains when they emerge. By analysing the bacteria, researchers can see that the bacteria has picked up antibiotic resistance genes and checks whatever the strain is wild or engineered. Today, the CDC categorizes plague as one of the biological weapons agents of highest concern, along with anthrax, smallpox, and viral fevers like Ebola and Marburg. Now, these ones coming up a lot lately. Smallpox, and this is related to the monkeypox, the jab, and we have a lot of debate now on whether viruses are real or not. I'm not going into that. But there's no doubt that bacteria is real. The scariest scenario would involve an aerosol version of the plague released like a cloud above a city or in a crowded area. The bacteria could be dumped from an aeroplane or even blown by a big fan, which could spark an outbreak of the pneumonic form of the illness, one that spreads rapidly through the air. So untreated patients with either of these conditions can develop pneumonic plague, the most serious form of the disease, which happens when the infection gets into the lungs. There are also rare white pestis strains that first infect the lungs, which cause a patient to leap straight to the most contagious form of the disease. When an infected person coughs, droplets of bacteria enter the air and can survive there for an hour or so. People in close contact with the patient are therefore most likely to be infected by these droplets, and in a nightmare scenario, those individuals could further spread pneumonic plague. So as Budman writes, plague is actually one of the oldest bioweapons out there. After all, the bacteria were being used as weapons long before anyone ever knew to call them bacteria. Plague-infected corpses were catapulted over walls. Venetians plotted to distill deadly liquid from swollen lymph nodes. Japanese planes sprinkled a rainfall of infected fleas. Those with nefarious motives and technical expertise wanted to weaponize the bacteria today, they could. So here we have ancient bioweapons being used with the bubonic plague, and Ironically, Venetians plotted to distill deadly liquid swollen from lymph nodes. And isn't it funny how all this plague managed to get all the way around the known world at the time through the sea merchant routes? This is probably one we need to watch out for in the future. If indeed there is some kind of food shortage and medical supply shortage, then there won't be any antibiotics to fight something like this bacterial infection. So it's a good idea to research natural forms of antibiotics and to keep stocked up on vitamins and keeping the immune system healthy. Here on this website, globalsecurity.org, we have information on weapons of mass destruction, plague used as a weapon, obviously, of mass destruction. And this is interesting here. It says the second pandemic began in China in 1330s between the years 1337 and 1346. A series of environmental disasters ranging from floods to locusts to earthquakes struck China. On the heels of these disasters came a plague that slowly spread westward along the trade routes. And this kind of coincides with the plagues of the Bible and ties in with around the time of the Crusades that we're told. And it's interesting, again, we have these trade routes linked to bubonic plague outbreaks. I mean, it only makes sense that people passing from different towns to town, spreading contaminants. Gabriel de Musis of Piacenza chronicled how the plague arrived in Europe in 1346. The plague arrived in Asia Minor, and the suffering precipitated violence between the Tatars and the Genoese merchants, who retreated to the Crimean coastal city of Caffa. So what does this mean? Tatars and Genoese merchants. So we have these Jewish merchants in Genoa, and they're more ancient, that come from the black nobility or the banking families. Remember, we have at the time of the Crusades the Roman Pierleoni family, who are a Jewish banking family who were behind Pope Urban at the time of the call or the decree for the Crusades. They come from the destruction of Jerusalem time that moved out into Europe. We have the Radhanite Jews, we have the Edomite convert Jews, the Pharisees. We also had the Herodians, and the Herod family and their followers, the Herodians, were very influential in Roman times. Now we have the Tatar Jews, the Tatars merchants, and they retreated to the Crimea coastal city of Caffa. So, this Tartarian empire, this grand Tartarian empire, is, as I've been saying, nothing more than the Khazarian empire. And I don't believe for a second that these Tatars, these Khazars of the Silk Road built the great empires of Europe and the beautiful buildings of Europe. I think that they are trying to claim history for themselves, and we can see this now with these Ukrainian wars and with these big Israel projects along the New Belt and Road Initiative with China, that this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to rewrite history. They're trying to write history in their name, and they're trying to now dominate the future history.
I think there's a resurgence of anti-Semitism because at this point in time, Europe has not yet learned how to be multicultural. And I think we're going to be part of the throes of that transformation, which must take place. Europe is not going to be the monolithic societies that they once were in the last century. Jews are going to be at the center of that. It's a huge transformation for Europe to make. They are now going into a multicultural mode, and Jews will be resented because of our leading role. But without that leading role and without that transformation, Europe will not survive.
So where's Caffa? So here's Caffa here. It's on this little peninsula here in the Crimea. It's up near the Ukraine. It's up in this Khazarian Ukrainian territory on the Black Sea. So if we see this little peninsula jutting out here, this is where Caffa is, and we go a little bit further north and we have Kiev. So it's telling us in the 1300s, supposedly, this timeline, that these Tatar merchants retreated to the Crimea. So it says the coastal city of Caffa, the present-day Ukrainian city of Feodosia. The Tatars besieged the city and catapulted bodies of plague victims across the walls. They are so benevolent, these Tatars, that built these wonderful cities. The great Christian Tartarian Empire, right? Don't be fooled by this storyline that Tartaria is Christian. It's not. In fact, Tartaria is the land of the giants, gigantic people in Tartaria, and we have these defenders of the dragon bankers, the Pierleoni dragon pharisaical Herod bankers, and they are Gog and Magog, the giants. So I don't know if I'm clutching at straws here, but I just found a sort of interesting link with the Pierleoni family. And it said that the Pierleoni family, meaning sons of Peter Leo, claimed to be descended from the ancient Roman noble family of Anisi. Now, if we look at this family, Anicia genus, is a plebeian family at ancient Rome mentioned first towards the end of the 4th century BC. The first of the Anici to achieve prominence under the Republic was Lucius Anicius Gallus, who conducted the war against the Illyri during the Third Macedonian War of 168 BC. So it says here that the only major branch of the family during the Republic used the cognomen Gallus, which may refer to a cock or to a Gaul. The surname Praenestinus, found in early times, may indicate that the family originated at the city of Praeneste. It was probably a personal cognomen, as it does not appear in later times. It says a branch of the family transferred to the Eastern Roman Empire, establishing itself in Constantinople, where Anicia Juliana, daughter of Western Emperor Anicius Olybrius, was a patron of the arts and rising in prestige. The scholar and philosopher Boethius was a member of the family, as was Anicius Faustus Albinus Basilius, the last person other than the emperor himself to hold the office of consul in 541 in the west. On the other side, Anici were supporters of the independence of the Western Empire from the eastern one. They were therefore supporters of the Ostrogothic kings of Italy, and such celebrated the King Theodahad. So, Gallus, or the cock, the chicken. So if we go to the Fab Pedigree page, we have this Sextus Anicius Faustus Paulinus, and this name pops up, Paulinus, and Pollio. The Pollio name pops up with these people. Faustus, this was a Herod line lineage. Caius Lulius Asinius Quadratus, or Rufus. So on this line, their family links back to the Herods, which is Julia of Cilicia, and her father was Alexander I of Cilicia. Here we have the Herod line: Herod Agrippa I, Julia of Chalcis, Herod Pollio of Chalcis. So this is supposed to be the line of Vespasian and Titus, the Herod Pollio line. Salamcio of Judea, Faisal of Judea, that's related to King Herod the Great's family, his brother and sister. Mariamne links into the Hasmonean line of the Judean Jewish royal family throne. And on her mother's side, Eotape of Commagene. And so if we go forward from Julia of Cilicia, she's back here on the father's side of Quintus Anicius Faustus Paulinus, and his father was Caius Asinius Quadratus Protimus. His mother was Julia Quadratilla, and it goes back to the Herod line on this side. And again on his mother's side, Julia of Cilicia, this is a Herod family line. Now we have this Paulus name here on the mother's side, Julia Minor Vipsania, Gaius Julius Caesar. So we have this Herod line that's married into the Julius Caesar line, Drusus Julius Caesar. This is the Caesar line, Nero Claudius Drusus. So this Lucius Sergius Paulus of Antioch, was from the Julian line. So this was the mother's line of Quintus Anicius Faustus Paulinus. The father's line is the Herodian line. His son Quintus Anicius Faustus. So this person has Herod and Caesar family lineage. There's a lot of names here that could be tied in here. Pollio, any of these Pollio names. There's a Herod line, Herod Pollio. His children, possibly Sextus Anicius Faustus Paulinus or Fausta. Paulinus, Pollio, Julia Quadratilla. This is a Herod family line. So we've got Herod family lines in power in Eastern Rome, in Western Rome. Herod of Chalcis, also known as Herod Pollio, king of Chalcis, Herod V. His first wife was his cousin Mariamne. So they're all married cousins, all these lines that we don't know names of, possibly cousin lines from the other brothers and sisters of Herod the Great. She bore him a son named Aristobulus, who also eventually became ruler of Chalcis. After Mariamne's death, he married Bernice, whom he had two sons, Berenicianus and Hyrcanus, around 41 current era. The request of his brother Herod Agrippa, Emperor Claudius, granted him the rule of Chalcis. Herod Pollio's son was Aristobulus of Chalcis. His wife was Salome of the John the Baptist story. And it's this Herod Pollio line that is said to be the line of Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus. Titus had an affair with Bernice, Herod Agrippa II's sister, and Vespasian's mother was a Pollio. Her name was Vespasia Polla. She was born in 15 BC. She was the grandmother of Emperor Titus and Domitian. Polla came from an equestrian family in Nursia. Vespasia married a tax collector, Titus Flavius Sabinus, and I think this Sabinus is another Herod name. We have Poppaea Sabina, who was the wife of Nero. She favored the Jewish people, and we can see why, I think. So it says here that Suetonius identifies her father as Vespasius Pollio. Now Vespasius Pollio is the Roman name, some people say, of Herod Pollio, Herod of Chalcis. There were a lot of Herod family members living in Italy at the time, in Rome and other places, just because Herod may have been of Chalcis or given the territory of Chalcis to rule. It's possible that the family lived in Nursia initially before he was given that dominion, and a lot of the Herod family members were educated in Rome, and they were educated along with the Caesars. On Ancestry.com, we've got a page that says Vespasius aka Herod Pollio family tree. Born in Roma, Lazio, Italy, Vespasius aka Herod Pollio. Passed away in Idumea, Israel. That's interesting. So in this article here, it's Asinius Pollio and Herod's son, Louis H. Feldman, Classical Quarterly. In a recent note, D. Braunt has challenged my identification of Pollio, at whose home in Rome Herod's son Alexander and Aristobulus stayed in 22 BC, as Gaius Asinius Pollio, the famous consul of 40 BC, who was a close friend of Julius Caesar, and whom Virgil dedicated his fourth Eclogue. Braunt's argument rests upon 5 grounds. If this Pollio were a man of stature of Asinius Pollio, we would expect Josephus to make his identity clear and not to describe him solely as one of Herod's most devoted friends. Josephus' reference to Pollio here is different from the definite reference to Asinius Pollio elsewhere in Josephus, where he is referred to as Asinius or Gaius Asinius Pollio. So this Gaius name is associated with Pollio. In the later passages, his name is spelled, that's in Hebrew by the looks of things, or Aramaic, I'm not sure, where the name of the host of Herod's son is spelt what looks exactly the same. So here and here, it's the same word. When Herod sent 2 other sons to Rome, they stayed with a certain Jew, and hence it seems likely that the 2 other sons likewise stayed with a Jew. Asinius' role in the elevation by the Roman Senate of Herod to the kingship of Judea was no greater than that of any other magistrate. So we can assume that Asinius Pollio was a relative of Herod. Considering we have Herod Pollio, it's a family name. And Gaius. So Gaius Asinius Gallus was a Roman senator, son of Gaius Asinius Pollio. He was second husband of Vipsania, eldest daughter of Marcus Agrippa, the first wife of Tiberius Caesar Augustus, who ultimately imprisoned him. So we've got Herod Agrippa. Now this guy looks a lot like another Herod. We have Gaius Asinius Pollio. We've got Herod Pollio. Now I don't know if it's just a confusion on part of the Agrippa name, but we have Herod Agrippa II, who was the brother of Bernice. She was the mistress of Emperor Titus and Drusilla. And online they continually use this bust for Herod Agrippa II. So cousins Salome and Aristobulus of Chalcis. We have the same bust being used for Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Here we have Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. And is this the same person? This almost looks like the same identical person. This is a different bust. It's a different bust, but it's practically the same person almost. Same features. If it's not the same person, they are genetically related or very identical. Herod Agrippa II was said to have never married or had children, whereas this person married Claudia Marcella Major, Julia the Elder. And his children were Gaius Caesar, Agrippina the Elder, and Agrippa the Posthumous. I'd say these people are related, or if not the same person. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa was a Roman general, statesman, and architect who was a close friend, son-in-law, and lieutenant to the Roman Emperor Augustus. He was responsible for the construction of some of the most notable buildings in history, including the original pantheon and is well known for his important military victories, notably the Battle of Actium in 31 BC against forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Born to a plebeian family around 63 BC in a certain location in Roman Italy, he met the future Emperor Augustus, then known as Octavian, at Apollonia in Ilaria. And this is where this Asini family come from. Following the assassination of Octavian's great uncle Julius Caesar in 44 BC, Octavian returned to Italy. So his early life, Agrippa was born around 63 BC in an uncertain location. His father was called Lucius Vipsanius. His mother's name is not known, and Pliny the Elder claimed that his cognomen Agrippa derived from him having been born breech. His sister's name was Vipsania Pola. So we've got this Pola name again. So Gaius Asinius Gallus married Vipsania Agrippina. Now we've got Herod Agrippa, Agrippina. These names seem to be in this family. And she had a son, Drusus Julius Caesar, was the son of Emperor Tiberius, and heir to the Roman Empire. She also had another son, Gaius Asinius Pollio, was a Roman senator. So Herod, king of Judea. So this is Herod the Great. Herod became the close friend of Augustus' great minister Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, after whom one of his grandsons and one of his great-grandsons were named. Both the emperor and the minister paid him state visits, and Herod twice again visited Italy. Augustus gave him the oversight of the Cyprus copper mines, with a half share in the profits. He twice increased Herod's territory in the year 22 to 20 BCE, so that it came to include not only Palestine but parts of what are now the Kingdom of Jordan and the east of the river and southern Lebanon and Syria. He had intended to bestow the Nabatean kingdom on Herod as well, but by the time that throne fell vacant, Herod's mental and physical deterioration had made it impossible. So Herod and the Herods were well known for their building, as well as Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. I want to know perhaps if there's this visual genetic similarity between Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Was he actually a relative of Herod? Was he one of his cousins? Was he one of his brothers? And, we have Herod's children living with a well-known Roman in Rome when they were being educated with the successive Caesars. So getting back to the Anicius family, Lucius Anicius Gallus. So Gallus is a popular name with this family, and this is where their family crest, or their relation to the rooster comes from. Gallus, which may refer to a cock or a gull. Wiki Historica, they have this family being depicted with a rooster on a background of blue and yellow. I'm not sure if that's their family crest, but it's kind of an interesting color choice considering we have the Ukrainian flag of blue and yellow. And the Ukraine is tied in with Georgia, and in Georgia, current day Georgia is called Chalcis. Modern day Georgia is the ancient world's Chalcis. So Gallus in Latin, from Galso, says it's a noun, Gallus, a cock or a rooster. The term Gallus is inherently masculine and refers to a rooster or cock, male chicken. The term Gallina is used for a hen, female chicken. The term Pullus, P-U-L-L-U-S, refers to a chicken without specifying the sex of the animal, although it often refers to chick. So remember, we have Herod Paulus. Now, in Spanish, polio means chicken. Polis from Latin, a young bird in the downy stage, a chick. Polis, in the word dictionary, polio, as in Herod, polio, in Latin, non-urban form of polio, from polis. Polis, from polis, means small, means little or small. That's kind of interesting. We have the little horn of the Bible. So I believe King Herod is the little horn of Daniel. And what's interesting is that the little horn in Daniel seeks to change times and seasons. And if we're looking at this time change during the Byzantine period, we have a connection with Herod's being in power, and times and seasons have been changed. Now this is from Bible Hub concerning Pollio and Asinius. Herod slays the principle of, and says, how Sosius and Herod took Jerusalem by force and besieged that, how they took Antigonus captive, has been related by us in the foregoing book. We will now proceed in the narration, since Herod and now the government of all Judea put into his hands, he promoted such of the private men in the city as had been of his party, but never left of avenging and punishing every day those that had chosen to be of the party of his enemies. But Pollio, the Pharisee, and Asinius, a disciple of his, were honoured by him above all the rest, for when Jerusalem was besieged, they advised the citizens to receive Herod, foretold in way of reproach to Hyrcanus and the other judges, how this Herod, whom they suffered now to escape, afterward inflict punishment on them all, which had its completion in time, while God fulfilled the words he had spoken. So is it possible that this Pollio, the Pharisee, and Asinius were Edomite converts in the temple system? You know, we had the conversion of the Edomites back in the time of the Maccabees. They had infiltrated into the priesthood and the hierarchy. And here we have a Pollio, a name related to the Herod family, advising people to allow Herod in and to be king and to take over Judea. So according to Henry Davis, Pollio is a common extra-personal name given to ancient Roman citizens, which the family of Herod the Great became. Further down it says, when investigating this historical documentation further, we can find that King Julius Tigranes VI of Armenia, born before 25 CE, an apostate of Judaism and a Herodian prince who served as a Roman client king of Armenia in the 1st century, married a noble woman of Phrygia near Chalcis called Opgali. Her existence known only through numismatic evidence of Tigranes' second kingship in a paper called Tigranes the 4th, 5th and the 6th, New Attributions, found on page 347 of the American Journal of Numismatics, Volume 2. Frank L. Kovacs suggests her inclusion on the coinage of Tigranes' second reign suggests a recent marriage, or at least an enhanced importance. Further reference is in Classical Numismatic Group Inc., King of Armenia Tigranes VI. So further down it says, if we look again at the name of Tigranes' wife Opgali, important points must be noted. Op looks to be Ops or Opis, a fertility deity and earth goddess of Sabine origin. Roman tradition states the cult of Opis was instituted by Titus Tatius and a Sabine king of Rome. And 2, Gali can be Gala, just as Mariamne can be Miriam, and Gala means the same as Pola, the feminine form of Pollio, cock, chicken, rooster, i.e. the same as Herod Pollio. If Tigranes' wife was the daughter of Herod Pollio, then the great-great-grandparents of Tigranes' daughter would be Herod and Mariamne on both her father and mother's side. Interestingly, Julia's brother, C. Julius Alexander, king of Cilicia, named his son C. Julius Alexander Bernicianus. So it's interesting, this name Gali comes up too. The Gala, the Met Gala event, the Gali, the transvestite priestesses. And, we have these Herodian priestesses of Artemis in Pergamon, and perhaps they were transgendered, who knows? But, Gali can be Gala. Gala means the same as polar, the feminine form of polio. So what they are is they are chickens, the egg layers. And eggs have a really esoteric meaning. So where I'm going with all this is that this Anisi family were the descendants of the Pierleoni family, the bankers who encouraged Pope Urban, I believe, to declare the war for the Crusades. Pope Urban II died in one of Pierleoni's castelli in July 1099. So we've got this massive big Herod link to the Roman banking families, the black nobility. Plague spread within the besieged city, more likely because of flea-infested rats rather than the gruesome Tatar projectiles. I don't know about that, because now they're saying that it's more likely that plague spread from person-to-person contact rather than fleas. And yes, plague's bacterial, but we need to remember supposed viruses, for example, with the current pandemic today, very rarely, if ever, cross species. So the general virology theory is that it takes a long time of two species living together for that viral contagion to mutate and cross species. And yet today we're having people believe that we have a virus that is crossing not only from bats to humans, but from cats to dogs to hamsters to fish. I mean, the list just goes on. The possibility of a virus jumping from species to species so easily is impossible. It's not even slightly possible. The Genesee merchants abandoned the city to return to Europe with the deadly bacteria in tow. Historians suspected the plague entered Europe through other trade routes as well. By 1348, the plague swept into Sicily and the Italian peninsula. Of the symptoms, Giovanni Boccaccio, I hope I'm saying that right, in the Decameron, translated in 1930 by Richard Aldington, wrote, "The symptoms were not the same as the East, where a gush of blood from the nose was the plain sign of inevitable death, but it began both in men and women with certain swellings in the groin or under the armpit. They grew to the size of a small apple or an egg, more or less, and were vulgarly called tumours. In a short space of time, these tumours spread from the two parts named all over the body. Soon after this, the symptoms changed, and black or purple spots appeared on the arms or thighs of any other part of the body, sometimes a few large ones, sometimes many little ones. These spots were a certain sign of death, just as the original tumour had been and still remained." So why did this bacterial infection that was obviously always there change to such a lethal contagion? What's also interesting, it says the first global pandemic of plague was believed to have begun in the Middle East in the 6th century current era. It reached Egypt by 542 CE, brought destruction upon the Eastern Roman Empire under Justinian, and spread across the European continent. Constantinople suffered approximately 40% fatality, and the destruction ushered in the Dark Ages of Europe. Spontaneous outbreaks continued until the 8th century current era. Now, if Constantinople lost 40% of its population, as I mentioned earlier, and decimated Europe and caused the Dark Ages, then we have this fight between the Islamic forces and the Byzantine forces in around 600, I believe it was. And, we've got this decimated Eastern Roman Empire, decimated Europe, and yet the Islamic forces couldn't make it topple at that time, didn't destroy it completely. And I think that's really weird, to be honest, that they didn't take Constantinople, that they didn't siege it, and they didn't take control of Constantinople at this time, and yet it took another 700 to 800 years later for the Islamic forces to topple Constantinople. And I think that this is worth further investigation. Who knows? I can't prove this. I'm going to look into this further. My whole conclusion on the hidden history and time is that I think it comes from this time period. I think that the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire came a lot earlier than they're saying it did. I think the Crusades happened possibly at a different time. And I think this fits in with biblical timelines. Am I trying to fit it to the biblical timeline? Well, anyone listening to this knows that the timeline has been fudged, it's been messed with to hide, I think, biblical truths. Also just to keep us in the dark about who and what we are. If you don't believe that this has happened, then you obviously just believe the narrative that we are given, and there's no point in watching or trying to research this topic. So I choose to believe biblical timelines over the secular version of history. However, I don't think it's been as messed with as we think. I think they've changed times, seasons, obviously, but I don't think it's until today or modern times that they're actually thought to pull a 1984 on us and completely rewrite history. If we consider that time has been changed, then we are definitely in the little season of Satan. We are definitely after the tribulation. All of these things, all of these events of Revelation have happened, and we're in the time where we are being persecuted by the dragon and by Gog Magog, and we are waiting for the return of Jesus. Whatever that means, however that looks, I guess we can't say for sure. Will we literally see him in the sky, in the clouds? Will we see him return in his people? What it means for us believers is that this system's coming to an end and better times are coming. And just finally, history of the Khazarian mafia. And I just want to find when the Khazarian Empire fell. The Kievan Rus finally razed the Khazars to the ground at the end of the 10th century. So we know the Khazars were working the Silk Road. They had slave trades. Citizens of neighboring countries, especially Russia, had complained to their leaders for so many years that they, as a group, sent an ultimatum to the Khazarian king. We know the story. He converts to the Jewish faith of the Talmudic traders on the Silk Road. The Khazar Empire was crushed in 1016, and the converted Khazars ended up as Jews in Eastern Europe. Now, most of Europe, as they spread to Europe, kicked them out, and they ended up in the Netherlands. As we know, traders, they were traders. Their profession was trading and merchantism on the Silk Road, which went to the Maritime Road. And this kind of ties in with the time period of the Crusades. So if we have the Khazarian Empire being crushed at this time, we have the Crusades and I believe the Byzantine Empire falling a lot earlier. We have a 1,000-year period where these merchants, this dragon, had been chained. It lost its power. The Silk Road trading routes declined. And then around the year 1666, we seem to have this historical reset where a lot of information has been changed and history has been rewritten. We have these time markers being changed on buildings and gravestones with different dates with I's and J's before them. I think that around the time this Silk Road, the Khazarian merchants were chained, they lost their power, and perhaps this is why they are attacking or have attacked Russia in the 20th century and now so harshly with their Bolshevism, is because it's payback for the Kievan Russians who raised them in the 10th century, apparently the 10th century, and chained them, bound them. The dragon was bound. And we can see this symbology in the Lord Mayor's parade in the City of London, where we have the giants of Gog and Magog, who are the Khazarian protectors of the dragon City of London. And in this particular year, they chained the Russian bear. But I'm going to leave it there. This is getting pretty long. So thanks for listening, everyone. I'll see you next time.
We all know the phenomenon of fake news. It's been a recurring topic ever since the rise of social media. But what if I told you that fake news were always a thing, and that very often dates and events were fabricated such as to serve a certain political narrative? This is still being done today and has always been done by the people in power. And one such case is the famous story of the fall of Rome in 476 AD. And this would prove such an incredibly powerful fake news that even today, 1500 years later, we still fall for that invention. So much so that Wikipedia entries and even history books all refer to the fall of Rome in 476. But how and why was it fabricated? When the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustus was deposed on September 4th, 476 AD by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, one powerless ruler was deposed and the barbarian general was now governing directly over Italy. This is now often quoted as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, Romulus Augustus, also often called Augustulus, the small Augustus, did not hold any real power. He was a child of around 11 years of age by 476, and the military of the Western Roman Empire, if it can even be called an empire by that time, was strongly in the hand of Germanic foederati. And this was by no means a new phenomenon. Already 80 years earlier, a half-Vandal general called Flavius Stilicho was holding the real power in the Western Roman Empire, and the child emperor Honorius was effectively for a long time just a puppet. This process accelerated more when the Western Empire started its decline, and especially after the Magister Militum Ricimer took control in 457, the emperors would more often than not be puppets. Majorian and Anthemius represent two heroic exceptions, but emperors such as Libius Severus or Olybrius were just puppets of Ricimer, and Glycerius was just a puppet of Ricimer's Burgundian nephew Gundobad. The Western Roman throne was sometimes vacant for many months before a new emperor was chosen, such as for example from 456 to 457. So that day in 476 was nothing unusual for the Romans. In fact, the event got no attention whatsoever from contemporaries in the West or the East. There was no outcry, no lamentation of a fall. Life in the city of Rome continued unchanged in 476. The Senate was still meeting, the urban prefect of Rome still elected, consuls were still chosen in the West. Rome was still Roman. Even in Ravenna, not much had changed. Instead of an 11-year-old powerless emperor, who was in fact just a puppet of his father Flavius Orestes, now a Germanic general was sitting on the throne. Life went on as normal, even in Ravenna. The imperial regalia were sent to Constantinople, and Odoacer was officially ruling in the name of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. Nobody was speaking of a fall of Rome. In fact, this was often seen as a reunification of the empire, where Italy was now a province of the Roman Empire instead of its own separate Western Empire. When Theodoric came to Italy on orders of Zeno himself, he overthrew Odoacer after some years of war, and thus the Austro-Gothic kingdom was born in 493. But still, nobody was speaking of a fall. On the contrary, especially the first decades of Theodoric's long rule were seen by many as a rebirth of the Western Roman Empire. Sicily was regained from the Vandals, and the Ostrogoths successfully campaigned against the Rugi and incorporated their kingdom into the realm of Theodoric. This Ostrogothic kingdom was not only larger but also more stable than the Western Roman Empire after the death of Majorian in 461. And when Theodoric stayed in Rome in AD 500 for more than half a year, he entered the city, as Cassiodorus writes, like a second Trajan. The procession of Theodoric through the city felt to many like the imperial triumphs of old. Nobody was speaking of decline. Instead, renewal and imperial rebirth were being proclaimed. The rebirth of the Western Roman Empire. After 510, Theodoric even reigned effectively over the Visigothic kingdom as a regent of his infant grandson Amalaric. This was indeed seen by many as the resurgence of a new Western Roman Empire. Theodoric himself presented himself in the fashion of the old Roman emperors and meticulously preserved ancient Roman traditions and laws. He allotted tax revenue for the restoration and protection of the old imperial buildings of Rome. He issued coins of notably higher quality than in the last decades of the Western Roman Empire, appearing like a Western Roman emperor himself, except for the mustache, which was distinctly Germanic, in order to underscore the parallels to Old Rome, but also in order to retain some Germanic identity. The Roman senators Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, Senator, and Anicius Manlius Severinus Boetius of the old Roman aristocratic family of the Anici were statesmen in Rome under Theodoric's rule, treating him by all means and accounts as a Western Roman emperor. Boetius even held the ancient office of consul in 510. Cassiodorus gives us detailed accounts of the surprisingly good state of the city of Rome in the early 6th century. I talked about that in this video here. But then after 520, the relations between the East and West began to worsen. Theodoric had Boetius executed in 524 on grounds of treason. Being a member of the old Anici family, the Eastern Roman Anici were outraged. Tensions began to rise between the Eastern Roman Empire and this new Western Roman Empire under Germanic rule. It is in that time that Marcellinus Comes would for the first time introduce the concept of the fall of Rome in 476. He was a Latin chronicler of the Eastern Roman Empire who spent most of his life at the court of Constantinople. Justinian, the new ambitious emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, needed a justification to invade the West. So Marcellinus Comes gave him one, namely that the West had been taken over by barbarians in 476 and that the Roman Empire had died in that year. It is in his work Annales that we can read for the first time about the fall of Rome in that year. This new viewpoint legitimized military actions against the West, as now suddenly the Romans living in the West were not part of a new resurgent Western Roman Empire of Germanic rule, but subjects to a hostile takeover of barbarians that were portrayed as brutally suppressing the native Roman population. It was a mistake of Theodoric to execute Boetius and others, such as Memmius Symmachus, because that would give the Eastern Roman writers a powerful topic to be used as propaganda. This made the Germanic rulers appear like bloodthirsty tyrants, where an invasion of the West now seemed necessary in order to liberate the poor Romans from this tyranny. Of course, the previous 30 years of very benevolent rule by Theodoric were not important anymore. Thus it was by Marcellinus Comes that the date of 476 was posthumously rebranded as the fall of Rome, simply because a ruler of Italic Roman descent was switched for a Germanic one. Now the pretext was there, and by 535 the war with the Austro-Gothic kingdom had begun. By 553 the war was over, but Italy completely devastated and destroyed. What could have been the real resurgence of a new Western Roman Empire, with ever-increasing degree of Romanized rulers, until at some point new Italic Western Roman emperors might have ruled, was utterly destroyed in its infancy. This Gothic War proved to be a giant catastrophe, and it effectively ended late antiquity and plunged Italy into the Dark Ages. I talked extensively about the disastrous effects which that war had onto Italy and onto Rome in these videos here. But so powerful did this Eastern Roman propaganda of Marcellinus Comes prove that later writers would copy that narrative from him. And so it was that even until this very day, most people still fall for this fabricated propaganda narrative of an Eastern Roman chronicler from 1500 years ago. And if you are interested in what the Gothic Wars did to Italy, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you are more interested in the consequences for Rome itself, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias amici imperii Romani, and bene valete.